It was the wrong time of year and the wrong hour of the day. In sunlight, in spring, the toll booths that stretched 8 across the highway bounced back the clean, sharp air of April as though they had just been painted. Green and gold with red lights, green lights, guiding into the lanes beyond the cars that jerked, that halted, that separated once through and vanished down the road. In autumn, in the afternoon, the paint on the booths mellowed in tune with the trees that flanked the tarmac, and the air was brisk and brittle and filled with the cries of Canadian geese. But it was November, past midnight, and Wes rubbed at his heavy arms encased in khaki as he waited for the next automobile to break from the darkness and feed him its toll. The air was damp, the stars gone, birds gone, and there seemed nothing left alive on the road except him. He'd taken the job, though hating the night shift when the electronics firm he'd managed folded in the dead wake of a dying space industry, and his engineering skills abruptly cheapened to less than a dime a dozen. For months he'd driven from California to Florida to Houston, and finally to a small apartment in Oxran Station. For months, he had filled with his precise small handwriting all the blanks and the boxes and the circles on applications, answered questions about his ambitions, and shook soft, tanned hands that bade him wait by the telephone for that miraculous call. That never came. Wes? It was a woman's voice, and he looked up and across the narrow space to the booth opposite. Terry was there, beckoning, and he shrugged. "Can't," he said ruefully. "Pete's not out here yet." "Oh, come on. There's no one coming. We'll get him out of the office, okay?" She was dark, less than half his weight, an Oxran native and mother of 6 who needed the money as badly as he, and worked the nights because the pay was twice as high. Normally, she grinned constantly, even when she was silent, but now her face, too much aged, was folded into a concerned frown that bothered him. She called him again, impatiently, and he nodded, pushed open the gate that penned him in, and lumbered down the single step to the gap between them. He glanced back up the road with an uncertain shudder, saw nothing, and hurried out of the November dark into the garish fluorescent glare of the Highway Authority office building squatting green and gold between 4 large pines. There were generally 4 on duty throughout the graveyard shift, 2 in the booths to keep each other awake, and 2 inside who spelled the others several times an hour to keep them all awake. Pete Hawkins, Wes's relief, pushed past him through the door, a punch to his arm and a smile and a nod. Wes didn't speak to him. There was nothing to say. Hawkins had known him for less than a week, and since they'd never shared coffee, they never shared dreams. Terry was already sitting at a long and low table, a paper cup in front of her, steaming gray. Wes sat, rubbing gratefully at his stomach, scratching at his thick neck. He remembered a time when he was reasonably thin, but with money tight, only starches and the like were easy to come by. "Wes, I've been had again." Again? He couldn't believe Terry would allow herself to be cheated more than once a month. But twice? Twice in the past 2 days, some jokers had driven through her lane and had given her fake coins in place of the real. And they weren't even imitations of quarters, but only the same size and texture. On their front, a small stylized pyramid. On their backs, various designs he hadn't understood. Wes What am I going to do, huh? I can't keep putting in my own money this way. I need every penny I can get. You know that. $4 worth in the last 2 weeks. You know how much I can do with $4 and 6 kids? Wes nodded, and a strand of black hair dropped to his forehead. He pushed at it, waited with one hand poised until he was satisfied it would stay. They must know when you're on, he said finally. They must think you're a sucker. I am, obviously. So they'll keep at it until you tumble at the wrong time. Wrong time for them, I mean. Don't you ever look at the money first? She laughed and shook her head. You like people too much, Wes, and you trust them too far. Someone could hand you a boilerplate, and you wouldn't know it until they were in Canada. Of course, I look at them, but they're silvery, and they weigh the same. Only when I got time to count and stack, then I notice. Damn, Wes, what am I going to do? You're going to get fired, he thought, when Pete finds out and tells the right people for him what's happening. And she must have sensed it because immediately her eyes filled with watery light. If Lou were still here, or Jess, or Mac, or Dave, he finished. But they're not, Terry. They're gone. Over the past 4 weeks, as many workers had walked off their jobs, Wes, who had been on the booths for just over 3 months, had gaped in astonishment every time it happened. It was, invariably, in the middle of the shift, somewhere near 3 when the road was at its most still, its most invisible. The lights from the gas station a mile east were out. The gooseneck lamps overhanging the broad toll plaza had been reduced to one on either side, and all the toll lights were red save one green facing in either direction. One by one, T-Ben, the men had climbed out of their booths and into their cars, backed them up, went through the lanes like ordinary commuter travelers or tourists, and vanished beyond the edge of the light. Not a word to anyone, not a letter once they had gone. And each one had passed to Terry one of the bogus coins. "Listen, Terry," he said when the silence began to unnerve him. "Tell you what I'll do. I'll switch booths with you, all right? And when one of them jerks tries anything on me, I'll break their arms? Sit on them," he said, and spread his arms to display his bulk. She pushed at her hair, shaking her head but smiling in spite of herself, and Wes relaxed. It would have been a hell of a long night if he and Terry hadn't been able to call to each other from their respective stations. Jokes, stories about her kids, his jobs, complaints about traffic, and the lack of it. Anything at all to keep from turning on the portable radio. Radios were death in the middle of the night. The music was loud enough to keep him awake, but the jockeys kept telling him the time he didn't want to know until the sun broke over the horizon. He supposed, he knew, it would have been cheaper just to keep the exact change lane open, but there was always some idiot with a $5 bill. At 4 in the morning with a $5 bill. His eyes would be stinging by then, because instead of sleeping when the sun came up, he would write his resumes and make calls, and once in a while take a sick day to drive out to an interview. He had done that yesterday, in fact, and finally there was a chance that he could kiss nickels and quarters and dimes goodbye forever. He had not mentioned it to Terry, though, because he didn't want to jinx it. He waited instead and walked with her back to the road. A yellow van was waiting in his lane, honking his horn and shouting for attention. At first, Wes thought the driver might be in trouble, but when he hurried to the island and tightroped to the gate, the booth was empty. The driver was met. Wes apologized for the delay, received a curse for a tip, and the quarter was thrown against his chest as the van sped away. "Terry," he called, "do you see Pete anywhere?" Silence. Then, "No," her voice thin in the damp air. It wasn't the best damn jobs in the world, he thought, as he strode angrily toward the parking lot behind the authority building. But damn it, whoever's doing it ought to do it right. For God's sake. He heard Terry calling him, ignored her, and rounded the back corner, and stopped. The lot was empty except for her station wagon and his sedan. Both of them were old, and both of them were alone. Good God, he thought, walked back to the plaza and stared east, then west, shaking his head. Asterix, asterix, asterix. The following night, there were 2 new takers, and one, a young blond man with a wisp for a mustache, appealed to Wes instantly. During one break then, instead of going inside with Terry, he leaned against the booth and they talked, trading lies and histories, until Wes learned that Joseph was a student looking to make ends and tuitions meet somewhere. It was hoped in the direction of bank account. "You're crazy, you know that?" Wes said with a grin. "How you going to study and do your papers out here, huh? You'll be dead for your classes, you know. You won't be able to stay awake." Joseph grinned, gap-toothed and pleasant. "I'll work it out, Wes. Don't worry, as long as I don't get fired for being cheated." "Terry told you?" "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I got one of them things just a few minutes ago while you were getting coffee." He held out his palm, and Wes picked at the coin clumsily, finally grabbing it and holding it close to his face. There was the pyramid, and on the opposite face, an odd representation of what looked to be some kind of bird. A hawk, he thought, or maybe an eagle. "Osiris," Joseph said. "What?" "That's Osiris there, I think. The head, I mean." "You're kidding," Wes said. "You mean folks are dumping Egyptian coins on us?" He couldn't wait to tell Terry, not that it would do her much, shrugged, and had turned to step down from the ledge when a station wagon pulled up and a hand stuck out. He couldn't move. It was Terry. He saw her through the windshield, and she was not exactly crying, not exactly happy. Her lips fought to give him a smile, but as soon as Joseph had taken her toll, her hand snapped back to the steering wheel, and he had to press tight against the booth to keep from being knocked off the island when she floored the accelerator and raced west toward the hills. "Damn," Joseph said. "She stuck me. Do you believe it, Terry?" He held out his hand. The coin was there. In the glove compartment, Wes remembered suddenly when they had arrived simultaneously at the parking lot, and he'd hurried over to greet her and help her from the wagon. She'd been fumbling in the glove compartment, had snatched back her hand as though it had been burned. She'd slid out quickly, grabbing his arm, but not before he saw the silver glitter lying on top of a folded worn map. "Joe, cover for me," he said quickly, and without waiting for an answer, raced for his car, put it in gear, and spewed gravel and dust in his haste to get on the highway. West of the toll plaza, the road ran straight for nearly 2 miles, then began a sinuous curve that climbed up the sides of 2 consecutive mountains. At the end of the level stretch was an exit, closed now for repairs and barricaded heavily, the shoulders flush against massive boulders that would prevent a car of any size from squeezing around it. Because of the land and the trees then, he knew there wouldn't be any way for Terry to leave the road for the next 22 miles. Foolish, he thought, as the speedometer climbed from 50 to 60, 65 to 70. What the hell is she running away from? His headlights punched weak holes in the blackness, and it seemed less like he was driving, more like he was floating through air that thickened the faster he went. He glanced down at the odometer and frowned when he realized it wasn't registering the miles he was traveling. Damn, he thought, another expense. He looked up, suddenly wrenched at the wheel, and slammed on the brakes, the car skewing to one side, the smell of burning rubber already sharp in his nostrils. When he stopped, he was shaking, and he laid his forehead against the cool plastic of the wheel until his stomach calmed and his arms stopped trembling. Then he slid out of the car. Directly ahead of him was a soft wavering light that stretched across the road from forest to forest. It wasn't the sun. He was facing west, and it wasn't a fire, because he could smell nothing but the rubber, felt no heat as he approached it. It was just a light that illuminated nothing. He wiped his hands nervously against his shirt, telling himself he was too tired to think straight, too anxious about the possible new job to think anything through. But he walked cautiously forward until, with a step, he was in the light. In it, not beyond it. And stretched for what seemed like miles in every direction were lines of automobiles. Abandoned, rusting. He reached out to touch one, pulled his hand back when his legs began to feel weak. Tired, that's all. The land was sloped down and away from him, and in the middle distance was a broad blue-white river. He could see on the near bank a small group of people straggling onto a river craft whose bow and stern were arched high and bent down toward the center of the deck like a double-sting scorpion, he thought. In the middle of the deck was a tiny cabin. The people, their faces dimmed by the suffusion of the light, bent and entered until they were all inside. Then, from a shadow on the bank, came a tall man who stepped up the gangway, pulled it to after him, and reached out for a pole attached to a rudder. As he did so, he looked up, and Wes blinked, turned abruptly, and ran. The man's head was not human. It was black. It was a dog. Suddenly, the light was behind him, and he was in his car, racing the engine and skidding into a U-turn. A cloud of deep black fear settled over him until, with a check in his rearview mirror, he realized that the light was gone. There was nothing behind him but the road. And it wasn't until he had stopped his sedan in the parking lot that he realized the car he'd almost touched on that congregated slope had been a station wagon, had been Terry's. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. So, Joe said near the end of the shift, he would finish wrapping up the dead, see, and take them to something like a courthouse where they'd be judged for whatever they did when they were alive. But Wes, I don't understand what all this has to do with Terry. Wes smiled weakly, said nothing, and as soon as the morning shift began filing out of the office, he waved a brusque goodbye and headed for his car. He drove for several hours, aimlessly, though keeping to the back roads to minimize contact with other cars. Then, when he could no longer see without squinting, He returned to his apartment and threw himself onto the couch, one arm over his eyes. He slept, did not dream, woke only once, when the telephone rang and a man, his voice officiously contrite, said, "I'm sorry, Wes, but that's the way it goes. Good luck." It was nearly 9 when he roused himself again, showered the sleep and fog from his mind, and dressed in the near-military uniform of khaki and green he was required to wear. Then he made himself a dinner of steak and potatoes, carrots and lima beans, the steak he had been saving for the celebration of freedom. He tasted almost nothing, spent most of the time chewing absently and staring at the wall clock over the counter by the sink. "I am an engineer," he told himself. "I do not believe in what I saw last night." But he could see how others might, and that's what frightened him. Times were bad, not for everyone, but for enough. And when this town becomes intolerable, you look toward the next one. The same with worlds. When life is lousy, like butting against a wall that doesn't even show the marks, you look for the afterlife. It has to be better there, right? It sure as hell can't get worse. And with organized religions falling apart under the weight of secular advancement and no scientific proof, it didn't take him long to see that somewhere, someone decided that maybe the good old days might hold the answer. And in this case, those good old days were numbered in the thousands of years. Someone who was steeped in Egyptology. Someone who deluded himself into thinking that if this life wasn't fair, maybe the gods would be. After all, gods don't die. They simply go into retirement until someone believes again. And if enough people believe, if enough people are miserable. Nonsense. He snapped at his knife and fork. Damned utter nonsense. But something told him, you can't deny the coins, and you can't deny the light, and you can't deny the fact that Terry has gone. He raced into the living room and scrambled for the phone book, found Terry's number, and called it. "I'm sorry," a man's voice said, "but there's no one here by that name. Are you sure?" "I'm sure, believe me. I've lived here for 6 years." He tried Peter Hawkins, who had lived with 2 friends. "Hawkins? I'm sorry, there's no one here by that name." He tried Dave Sparker, who lived with his parents. "Is this a joke? We ain't never had any kids, Mac. I'm sorry, Wes, but that's the way it goes." He closed his eyes to imagine Terry as he'd last seen her, hands clutching the wheel, eyes determinedly straight ahead, but the look she had given him before she drove official relief. Sad, but relieved. He shook his head and left for work, found Joe already seated at the table in the break room, and slid in beside him with a cup of coffee. "I'm cracking up, kid," he said, and explained. Joe listened attentively, tracing designs on the table's plastic top until Wes had done. "Interesting," he said. "But for crying out loud, Wes, you know it can't be true. I know what I saw." The young man grinned. "You know what you think you saw, right? Look, Wes, just for the sake of argument, let's assume that what you're saying is true. Then why are there still ghettos and rundown slums and unemployment and stuff like that? I mean, if life is so rotten, why haven't all those people taken this way out? It doesn't make sense." Terry just decided it was time to get out before she cracked. That's all. She was doing something for herself for a change. But the kids, did you ever see them? Wes frowned, shook his head. But, he said, our whole society is based on the reach of the automobile, right? How many really poor folks have one? The car gets you out, see? You wake up one day, and your fare is in the glove compartment, and off you go. A little sad, maybe, because you're leaving your friends and what all, but you know it's going to be better, so you go. Joe shook his head, grinning. Wes, you should have been a writer or something. For an engineer, you got a hell of an imagination. But, he added quickly, a hand up to quiet him, assuming one more time that this is also, what do you and I have to worry about? We're not starving, are we? I'm getting good grades all the time, and you're getting more and more interviews, so you're bound to hit one sooner or later. You're too good. It's just a matter of time. He clapped Wes on the shoulder, pointed at the clock on the wall, and reached up for the fur-lined jackets they would be wearing that night. He helped Wes into his. Wes returned the favor, and they trudged out to the toll booths to begin the shift. He's right, Wes thought, as he nodded to the man leaving his booth. I'm letting myself panic, that's all. I'm losing faith in myself, and I can't let that happen. At the first break, neither of them had been handed the silver pyramid coins. At the second, Joe had had one. Wes decided to do some figuring, and, for the next few nights, kept a record of the fake coins as they flowed into the booths. Joe was getting worried, but like Terry, he replaced the fares with money of his own. So did Wes. And by the end of the month, he noted with curious calm that there was an increase in the number of cars that passed along the road between the hours of 12 and 3, so much so that the authority was toying with the idea of putting on 2 extra men. And as the cars increased, so did the coins. There was no geometric progression, only 1 or 2 more each night, but in no case was he able to catch a glimpse of the driver after he'd realized what he'd been handed. If this keeps up, he said to Joe one January night, we're both going to be broke. Not me, Joe said, grinning. You'll be happy to know, sir, that this toll taker is giving his notice. What? That's right, Wes. I just got word. There's a scholarship waiting for me on the West Coast, and I'm taking the first flight to San Francisco I can get. He slapped at the table and laughed. Done, pal. This boy is done taking quarters for the rest of his life. I'll kill him, the supervisor said when Joe left an hour early, laughing, shrieking his delight that his nights would now be his own. I'll get that punk if it's the last thing I do. He can't leave me short like this, damn it. He can't. Wes tissed and shook his head. Revenge is not charity, he said, unable to keep back a grin. He slept well that day, rose just after 6, and made himself breakfast. Then he checked his mail, opened one rather thick envelope, and threw the rest into the air. It had come. In Iowa, a firm was looking for an electronics man with just his qualifications, and more importantly, it had the funds to offer him a salary not much less than he'd been making with his own company. Unashamedly, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, shaving, crying, shaking his head, and wishing Joe had waited one more day to hear his own fine news. And Terry, he rinsed the razor under the faucet and wondered if he would have had the nerve to ask her to marry him. It would have meant instant family, of course, but it would have. Might have stopped razor into the sink, stalked into the bedroom, and pulled on his clothes so viciously that he tore 2 shirts at the shoulder before calming enough to get one on properly. "Knock it off, pal," he muttered to himself as he hurried downstairs to the parking lot and his car. "You got the wrong number," and she took off someplace else. Someplace real, pal, someplace real. Hawkins. Sparker. His mood grew heavy gray, like a storm grumbling on the horizon. He snarled at everyone at the office, including his supervisor, and it was well past midnight before he was able to force himself to relax and remember the job. The job! He laughed aloud as a car pulled into the gap and a hand reached up to him. He leaned down to take the coin, still laughing until he saw Joe's face in the dim dashboard light. The young man was unshaven, pale, perspiration running down his face as though it were the middle of summer. His jaw trembled, his lips quivered, and before his hand slapped back to the wheel as if magnetized, he gasped one word. "Supervisor." Wes yelled as the car shot out of the gap and vanished down the black road, the taillights glaring at him redly until, abruptly, they vanished. He had no intention of looking at his palm. He knew what would be there. For several minutes, he stood there numbly, unthinking, then snapping back to the day Joe had quit and the supervisor had ranted for the rest of the night. Wes groaned and threw the coin away. Joe believed, Joe knew, that Wes's intellectual game playing was not playing at all, that he was right about the depression that had fallen on people, the need to escape, the need for comfort. But he was also wrong about one vital matter. Those gods, all of them shunted aside in the glare of science's advance, were not calmly returning to embrace their people again. They were angry. They hated. Wes bolted from the booth and ran for his car. As he rounded the corner of the building, the supervisor slammed open the rear door and began shouting at him, cursing, then running to the exit and grabbing for the open window door as Wes slowed for the narrow gate. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" "Iowa," Wes said, punching at the hand until it fell away. "Fine, then take this and don't expect to be paid." Something flew from the supervisor's hand into Wes's lap, but he ignored it until he'd pulled onto the highway and was heading rapidly west. Then he freed a hand from the wheel and picked it up. It was his time card. He laughed, made to toss it out the window, then decided to hang on to it as a souvenir of his tenure in the booths. As his headlights turned the air gray in front of him, he leaned over and dropped the glove compartment lid, took his eyes from the road long enough to shove the card in, and saw the silvered coin. "But I don't believe it," he screamed to the steering wheel that refused to release him. "I don't," he insisted when the light engulfed him and the car stalled and the slope to the river pulled him gently. "Please," he whispered to the dog-headed man, "I don't believe in you." "That," said the man with the head of a jackal, "is no longer my problem." Yeah!